All right, Google has distributed its response to a request from the Federal Communications Commission asking why one of the company's iPhone applications was rejected from Apple's online store. And the FCC says it is looking into the matter as part of a bigger push into examining exclusive relationships between wireless carriers like AT&T and phone makers. Google's own response to the FCC says iPhone owners can use a web browser version of its Google Voice product, but the features are more limited than the rejected application. AT&T, for its part, says it had no role in any decision by Apple to reject the Google Voice application. We'll continue to bring you details on that story as we get them. Staying on that note, the two biggest wireless companies in the U.S. are facing a government inquiry into their policies. The FCC wants to know whether Verizon and AT&T make it too hard for subscribers to switch, and whether they make it tough on competitors by denying them connections. AT&T and Verizon have 60% of the U.S. wireless market. And for their part, Verizon says it is looking forward to beginning a dialogue with federal regulators, while AT&T says when you look at the facts, you can see a lot of choice in the wireless industry. And for more on this topic, Paul Glenchur, senior analyst at Potomac Research Group, joins us to talk about what AT&T and Verizon face as far as FCC inquiries, and if the FCC should indeed be doing that. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Paul, thanks for coming on the show. Let me ask you, first of all, about AT&T's response, first of all, to the FCC's inquiry. They say, hey, there's a lot of choice out there for consumers. Isn't that the case?
I think that's right. But there's a rising concern that AT&T and Verizon Wireless have just gotten bigger and bigger, largely through consolidation, and that they'll have the kind of strength and scale and resources to increase their gap above the other wireless providers. So I think there's some increasing anxiety about that with the new administration.
So what can the FCC do about that?
Well, they're beginning to look at ways to enhance competitive opportunities for other carriers, and they're looking at issues like handset exclusivity, where really all the carriers have the opportunity to lock up exclusive handset deals. But the hottest handsets tend to go to Verizon, go to AT&T, although the Pre went to Sprint. But they want to look to see whether those exclusives are disadvantaging smaller carriers. They're also looking at roaming, a way of trying to give automatic and reasonable cost access to the larger networks of the big carriers to facilitate nationwide calling and services for the smaller carriers. So they're looking at ways to try to level the playing field, but I think regulators can only go so far in trying to do that.
What's the question about connections? I mean, do these bigger companies give smaller competitors easy connections? Should they give them easy connections on their networks that, after all, they've invested in to build up themselves?
Well, that's what the fight is about to a great extent. Roaming has gotten more and more difficult for the smaller carriers, they contend, because the larger carriers just don't need them as much. As they buy a lot of smaller carriers and even some carriers in rural territories, their need to roam on other networks diminishes, but the smaller carriers that are still independent need the larger carriers even more. So the FCC has been looking at ways to try to make these roaming arrangements easier to work out for the smaller carriers, and I think the regulators will do more along those lines.
All right, Paul, I wonder what you think we're going to see as far as speed here from the FCC, because if you think about how long AT&T's contract is with Apple anyway, will the FCC get done with this kind of investigation before those kind of contracts are expired?
That's not clear, and there's some thought that they could do something of an enforcement measure here. I don't think that's as likely. I don't know that the rules would really let them go very far with respect to this Apple-Google issue. But I think they could craft new rules that they could enforce, many months down the road to try to ease future arrangements that could benefit the smaller carriers. But I don't think anything real fast is likely here.
Does that kind of agreement, incidentally, between AT&T and Apple, for example, does it benefit the hardware maker as much as it benefits the network maker?
Yeah, there's a good argument that it benefits them quite a bit, because if you have an exclusive arrangement, then you have a carrier willing to subsidize the distribution of that phone and to basically make volume commitments to the distribution of that phone. And it also allows the carrier then, to help reduce the innovation risk that the device manufacturer has to take on. And also it allows the device manufacturer to contour the service, the device to a specific network that could reduce some of the glitches when you begin to roll out the device at the outset. So there are some benefits to the device manufacturers of these exclusive arrangements, too.
All right. Hey, Paul, thanks very much for joining us. Paul Glenchur there from Potomac.